Nathan A. Sales serves as the Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism. In this role, he manages 7 bureaus and offices within the State Department that are dedicated to protecting civilian security by preventing and addressing terrorism, mass atrocities, and violations of human rights and the rule of law. And he is here with us today straight from Washington, D.C. Hello, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for being on our show. My first question would be, what exactly is counterterrorism, and what is your role within counterterrorism in prevention? I know that before our interview, we discussed 3 regions, important regions, where we can witness counterterrorism and we can analyze them as such. And here we're talking about Iran, Afghanistan, and Africa.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation. You know, I think the world has wanted to move on from counterterrorism. After the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11th, 2001, counterterrorism was really the United States' top national security priority, top foreign policy priority. But in more recent years, we've seen with conflicts in Ukraine, with an increasingly assertive China, we've seen that policymakers in Washington have wanted to change the subject and move on to dealing with these other very pressing challenges. And I think that makes a lot of sense. We have to be mindful of how the geopolitical environment is changing and how the threats to the United States and to our NATO allies like Romania are also changing. But we can't afford to take our eye off the ball. We have to continue to devote time and energy and resources to countering our terrorist enemies, because they get a vote on whether they continue to wage war against us, and they are voting yes. You know, right now we're seeing a resurgent ISIS affiliate in Afghanistan known as ISIS Khorasan province. This is a branch of ISIS that has carried out a number of deadly attacks outside of Afghanistan. They've carried out attacks inside Iran. They've carried out attacks inside of Pakistan. They've even carried out attacks in Moscow, and they have their eye on Europe as well. So it's a difficult time for policymakers because they're having to juggle so many different threat streams. But we can't afford to stop focusing on terrorist threats, even as we deal with the fallout from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and as we're dealing with a Chinese Communist Party that is trying to upend the world order.
So when we talk about terrorism, are we referring strictly to bloody terrorist attacks, or can we take into account cyber terrorist attacks such as sensitive data information, bank crypted information?
Well, it's a great question. We've seen with ISIS in particular that ISIS has been able to use online capabilities to really radicalize populations around the world and use that in order to recruit foreign fighters. You know, back in 2014, 2015, ISIS was being very innovative in its use of social media, in its use of other online capabilities to reach target populations in Western Europe, to reach target populations in the Middle East, in North Africa, and inspire them to come to join the so-called caliphate. You know, tens of thousands of people heard that call and decided to leave their comfortable lives behind and take up arms to fight for this bloody terrorist group. So when we talk about counterterrorism, you know, we have to be comprehensive in our understanding of what the threat involves. It's not just terror group that's beheading people or carrying out attacks involving roadside bombs, because there's a lot of stuff, a lot of activity that happens before a terrorist organization even gets to that point. And so you have to go after the sources of money that are used to buy weapons and use weapons. You have to go after the recruiting channels that are used to draw fighters into conflict zones. You also have to be mindful of their ability to exploit the internet for their own nefarious purposes, and certainly cyber is an important part of that.
As per your definition of counterterrorism, on a scale from 1 to 10, how present is terrorism in the United States of America and also in Western Europe?
Well, I think there's a couple of disturbing trends that we're seeing. The first one, as we've already discussed, is the Afghanistan branch of ISIS Khorasan province. U.S. officials have been warning for some time now that this organization has the intent to carry out strikes around the world and is also developing the capability to carry out strikes around the world. And we're starting to see that come to pass now. The other thing that I'm worried about is the effect of the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and the risk that this could radicalize people to carry out acts of terrorism in the West on their own. Maybe an individual who's not formally affiliated with Hamas or Hezbollah or some other terrorist group might be so radicalized, so susceptible to propaganda that they decide they are going to independently carry out a terrorist attack in the United States or someplace in Europe. That's a much more difficult challenge to deal with, because it's much harder to detect a person who is individually radicalized and decides on their own to carry out an attack without being told to do so, without being trained, without being provided with money or equipment. The weaker the formal ties between a potential terrorist and an official terrorist group, the harder it is for law enforcement and intelligence personnel to identify that person and potentially stop an attack. So that's another trend that I think bears very close attention.
When might the fighting between Israelis and Palestinians cease? Because you mentioned this conflict previously.
Right. Well, it's difficult to say. Let's take a step back and look at the big picture. What is happening in Israel and Gaza right now? Well, for years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been pursuing a so-called Ring of Fire strategy. What they have been doing is lavishly funding and equipping and arming terrorist groups that are active in the region and that represent a threat to Israel. So in the north, in Lebanon, the Hezbollah terrorist group has received hundreds of millions of dollars from Iran over the years. In Gaza, Hamas is another terror proxy of Iran. In Yemen, the Houthi rebels are a terrorist organization that has received advanced weapons and other forms of support from Iran. All of these different tentacles are part of the same octopus, and the head of the octopus is Iran. So why is there a conflict going on right now? What we're seeing is effectively a proxy war between Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is responsible for having mobilized and funded many of these terrorist groups that Israel has to deal with on a daily basis. What does the future hold? Well, Israel has said that its aims in this war are to completely destroy Hamas, to prevent it from ever having the military capability to hit Israel again, like it did on October 7th of last year, a deadly terrorist attack that actually was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. So an incredibly deadly event that Hamas has said it intends to repeat, not once, not twice, not 10 times, but hundreds of times until Hamas accomplishes its goal of completely destroying the Jewish state. So Israel's war aims are to prevent Hamas from ever being able to do that again. In order to do that, Israel needs to clear a lot of territory in Gaza where these Hamas commanders and where these Hamas fighters are located. The next region, the next part of Gaza that looks to be the locus of conflict is going to be Rafah. Now, right now, there's over 1 million, maybe 1.5 million Palestinian civilians who are sheltering there. And so the key is going to be for Israel to find a way to relocate these civilians, to provide them with protection so that they're not caught in the crossfire between Israel and Hamas, because that is exactly what Hamas wants. Hamas and other terrorist groups hide behind civilian populations, put those civilians at risk in order to make it harder for Israel or other countries or other adversaries to remove those terrorists from the battlefield. Some people have referred to this as human shields. I think, honestly, it's even worse than that. It's human sacrifice. Hamas actually wants these poor Palestinian civilians to suffer as much as possible and to lose their lives because they can use that in the propaganda war against Israel.
So do you think that the financial aid is what is actually escalating the conflict within the Middle East, and this will increase to terrorism?
I think that Iran has been pouring enormous amounts of money into terror groups that serve as its proxies. And the reason Iran has done that is because it knows that it cannot win a head-to-head overt conflict with Israel, or certainly with the United States. And so rather than risking open, direct conflict, Iran has made a judgment that it is better for it to hide behind terror proxies like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so what the future holds, it's hard to say. But we do know that Iran in the past 4 years has been able to sell tens of millions of dollars worth of oil, tens of billions of dollars worth of oil. Where's that money going? Well, it's not going to improve the lives of ordinary Iranians. It's not going to shore up the jobs market in Tehran. It's not going on infrastructure projects in Iran. A lot of it is being used to buy bombs and other weapons, such as drones, that the Islamic Republic can use to menace Israel and the United States, either directly or more often indirectly through its proxies.
Do you think that the tension in the Middle East will increase the risk of terrorism elsewhere in the world?
I think that's a very real risk. We know that Iran has funded terror proxies not just in the Middle East, but globally. In the 1990s, Iran-backed terrorists blew up the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and then also blew up a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. You wouldn't necessarily think that the Western Hemisphere would be in Iran's terrorist crosshairs, but they actually were in the 1990s. And this is not just ancient history, because over the past 10 to 15 years, here in the United States, our Federal Bureau of Investigation has arrested a number of operatives associated with Hezbollah, the same Iran-backed terrorist group that was active in South America. What were they doing here? Casing targets, raising money, storing weapons, getting ready to be activated. So we have to assume that there are more here right now awaiting activation orders. And it's not just in the United States. In Bulgaria, there was a terrorist attack by Hezbollah several years ago in Burgas, where a bus driver and a number of Jewish tourists who were on that bus were killed. So clearly, the risk of terrorism is not limited to the Middle East. It's a threat that we face here in the Western Hemisphere. It's a threat that we face in Europe as well.
However, today's world is much more closely monitored, and my question would be, would a 9/11 event still be possible?
You know, we've learned a lot since 9/11, which is almost a quarter century ago now. The United States and our close allies in Europe, our NATO allies, have taken a number of steps to make it harder for terrorists to get access to our respective homelands. Here in the United States, we have much better systems for collecting information about terrorists, for processing it and sharing it, for identifying travelers who are coming to our country who are higher risk. And our European allies have implemented similar measures. So I think the risk of a 9/11 style catastrophic attack, it's not zero, but I think it is lower today than it was in any point in the past 25 years. But that doesn't mean we can declare victory and go home, because the threat of terrorism is changing, it's evolving. And a large-scale catastrophic attack like 9/11 may not be imminent, may not be plausible in the foreseeable future, but we still have to worry about our southern border. What about in the millions of people who have been able to come across our southern border over the past several years? How many of them are terrorists? How many of them were able to slip into the country undetected? That's a concern that we have to have. We also have to be concerned about the possibility of independent terrorists who are not formally members of groups, but who might be radicalized and decide to carry out an attack because they were inspired by these groups. So the threat is different. It's not what it was on September 10th of 2001, but it hasn't gone away, and we need to be vigilant.
Let's redirect our attention a bit towards Russia and Putin. And my question would be if we should expect, after the unjust wars that Russia is conducting in Ukraine, that Russia would wage unjust wars in countries supporting Ukraine?
I think that's a real concern, and that is why it is so important for the United States and our NATO allies to remain steadfast in supporting Ukraine. We know what Putin's ambitions are, and it's not limited to Ukraine. What he wants to do is relitigate Russia's loss of the Cold War. He wants to restore the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, and turn Central and Eastern Europe into Soviet or Russian vassal states. He cannot abide the thought of vibrant democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, which serve as a rebuttal to his argument in favor of strongman authoritarian rule at Russia. He doesn't want the Russian people to see that there's another way, and it's just across the border in places like Romania and Bulgaria and Poland. And so if Ukraine falls, that is just the appetizer for Putin. That doesn't mean that his appetite has been satisfied. It just means that he's moving on to the next course. And I worry very much that we would see Putin start to take even more actions to destabilize the countries, the NATO allies of the United States on the Eastern Front, the Baltic states, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania. All of these countries could face anything from disinformation campaigns launched by the Kremlin to little green men coming across the border to, in the worst case scenario, open conflict. And that is something we want to avoid at all costs. The way to avoid that is to help the Ukrainians win now. If Ukraine wins, if Ukraine is able to hold off the Russians from invading and occupying and subverting their country, that helps us deter Putin from taking even more ambitious moves against the NATO Eastern Front.
How do you collaborate, if at all, with Romanian security agencies?
Well, Romania is a close ally of the United States. It's a NATO partner, has been for, I think, 20 years now. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of NATO's expansion to include Romania. And I think that's better for the United States and it's better for Romania. Both countries are better off when we have a strong alliance that helps ensure that the Eastern Front in Europe is stable and protected against Russian aggression. So certainly the relationship between the American military and the Romanian military is very strong. The relationship between our law enforcement personnel, between our intelligence personnel is very strong. When you're in an alliance, a defensive alliance like NATO, that enables many, many different forms of cooperation above and beyond what you would enjoy with other types of alliances.
Does the USA also facilitate training for Romanian military personnel, non-NATO, in our country in anti-terrorist activities?
I think the relationship, the security relationship between the United States and Romania really covers the full spectrum of threats that we could face as allies. Certainly, we are mindful of terrorist threats, and we have to cooperate on that, including through joint exercises or training. Certainly, we have to be mindful of the very threat that NATO was established to protect against, and that is an imperialist Russia, an aggressive Russia that seeks to destabilize our countries and potentially invade and occupy them. And so we cooperate with each other on building capability against that threat and being prepared against that threat, because ultimately, deterrence is the name of the game. The more powerful the NATO alliance is, the stronger our capabilities working together, the stronger the message to Russia that don't even try it, you will lose, don't try, and in that way we preserve peace through strength.
Can you tell me what the budget for counterterrorism in the USA approved by Congress is, if the number is not under strict secrecy? And as a recommendation for the other NATO states, which NATO countries which are required to allocate 2% of their GDP to military expenses for defense, would you recommend another percentage for those NATO member states?
Well, so on counterterrorism funding, it's hard to answer that because there are so many different types of counterterrorism programming. Congress spends money to provide new capabilities to our intelligence community, to our military, but also, in addition to hard power forms of counterterrorism, Congress spends a lot of money on soft power counterterrorism, diplomatic engagement, programs, capacity building, efforts to prevent radicalization, efforts to de-radicalize people who have succumbed to the siren song of terrorist ideology. It's hard to put a dollar figure on that, but it is an important part of the United States security posture. When it comes to collective security under NATO and our obligation to spend, to invest in our own self-defense, 2% of GDP is really the floor. Back in 2014, I think, at the Wales summit, when NATO leaders agreed that they would spend at least 2% of their GDP, we were in a very, very different world. That was around the time of Russia's initial incursion into the eastern parts of Ukraine and illegal occupation of Crimea. But since then, a lot has happened. We've seen the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We have seen China become even more militaristic and assertive in the Indo-Pacific region. We have seen Iran become much more assertive and militaristic. And so because the nature and scope of the threats facing the NATO alliance has expanded so dramatically, I think NATO leaders need to think about whether 2% is enough. Frankly, I think 2% has to be the bare minimum. And the United Kingdom, for instance, has started to float the possibility that the alliance needs to rise up to a 2.5% commitment. That sounds about right. The threats are not getting less. We need to invest properly in our own self-defense. 2% may not cut it anymore.
Thank you for the valuable information, Ambassador Nathan A. Sales. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.